The United States never intended to win a war against Iran. It intended to make Iran destroy itself. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of line that belongs on a conspiracy board covered in red string. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through is not a theory, it is a sequence. And when you see it laid out step by step, you won't be able to unsee it. This is not a military story. It is not a sanctions story. It is not even a story about oil, though oil runs through every vein of it. This is a story about architecture, the slow, deliberate construction of a trap so precisely engineered that the target doesn't realize it's inside until the walls have already closed. The Americans didn't need to fire a single cruise missile at Tehran. They needed Iran to fire at itself. And that process, if the intelligence is right, is already underway. This is Iron Dispatch. I'm glad you're here. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what we're tracking in the next several weeks may be one of the most consequential unravelings in modern Middle Eastern history, and you'll want to be here when it accelerates. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the political beginning, the structural one. Iran is the world's fourth largest oil producer. Read that again, fourth largest. The country sits on one of the most staggering reserves of hydrocarbon wealth on the planet, and yet, and this is the detail that should make you pause, Iran does not have enough domestic refining capacity to process its own crude. It produces the raw material and cannot fully convert it into the fuel its own population needs. That structural dependency was not an accident of geography. It was the first brick in the wall. For decades, Iran's economy has been strangled at the margins through sanctions, isolation, and financial architecture designed to prevent Tehran from modernizing its refineries. Every time Iran tried to build capacity, the access to technology was cut. Every time it tried to source components, the supply chains were quietly severed. The result is a country with enormous underground wealth that is functionally unable to fully monetize it without international infrastructure it cannot legally access. A dragon sitting on gold it cannot fully spend. Now add the next layer. Between 30 and 40% of Iran's entire economy, construction, telecommunications, oil extraction, banking, is controlled not by the elected government, not by the technocrats in the finance ministry, but by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is not simply a military branch, it is a parallel state. It is a sovereign economic entity with guns. It owns the ports, it controls the contracts, it determines who gets rich and who doesn't. And because it controls so much of the visible economy, it has made itself, in its own estimation, indispensable. But here's what nobody is talking about. Iran International, one of the few Persian-language outlets genuinely willing to report on internal fractures, has been documenting for 2 years a slow, quiet collision between the IRGC and the formal government apparatus. This is not a dramatic coup in progress. It is something far more dangerous. A bureaucratic war of attrition, fought in budget meetings and contract disputes and personnel appointments, where the IRGC slowly absorbs everything and the government slowly loses the legitimacy to govern. When you control 30 to 40% of the economy and you answer to no auditor, no parliament, and no electorate, you become the state. And when you become the state, you also inherit all of its contradictions. The IRGC became the thing it replaced, and that is when it became vulnerable. Because here's the geometry of the trap. You don't need to destroy something from the outside if you can create the conditions under which it destroys itself from the inside. The Americans understood this. The Israelis understood this. And perhaps most importantly, the architects of the current pressure campaign understood that the sequence matters more than the event. Let's talk about Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes through it. Iran has spent 30 years positioning itself as the gatekeeper, the power that could, in theory, shut off the global oil supply with enough military pressure on that narrow channel. It was always the trump card, the last card, the card that was supposed to make Iran untouchable. But the card has a flaw, and the flaw is this. The moment you play it, you reveal that it was all you had. Intelligence assessments circulating in analytical circles, and corroborated by independent energy analysts, project that Iran's above-ground oil storage capacity will reach its limit within 10 to 14 days of a sustained export blockade. 10 to 14 days. That is not a strategic buffer. That is a countdown clock. The moment Iran's storage fills, production has to slow, then stop. The revenue stops. The foreign currency reserves stop replenishing. And in a country where the IRGC has spent a generation extracting value from the system rather than building it, there is no reserve engine to compensate. The trap is not a blockade of Hormuz by the United States. The trap is the permanent, credible threat of one. You don't have to close the strait. You just have to make the world believe you might. Because the moment that belief takes hold, the moment tanker insurance rates spike, the moment shipping companies reroute, the moment buyers quietly begin diversifying their supply chains away from Iranian crude, Iran begins bleeding without a single shot fired. Slowly, quietly, precisely. Stay with us because this is where it gets far more complicated and far more dangerous than most coverage acknowledges. Now look at what happened on February 28th. The date is significant not because of a single dramatic event, but because analysts tracking internal Iranian military communications point to it as a fracture point. A moment when tension between the Artesh, Iran's conventional military, and the IRGC broke into open institutional conflict. The Artesh is Iran's formal standing army. It predates the revolution. It has a different culture, a different command structure, and increasingly, a different set of grievances. For years, the IRGC has received the prestige postings, the advanced equipment, the political connections. The Artesh has received the leftovers. When you have an army that describes itself as 1 million strong, and reports emerging from the field describe frontline units receiving 20 rounds of ammunition per soldier, you are not looking at a military force. You are looking at a performance, 20 rounds. At the rate of fire of a standard automatic weapon, that is approximately 2 seconds of sustained engagement. 2 seconds. Any soldier handed 20 rounds and pointed at a live threat is not being armed. He is being staged. And the men being staged know it. This is the part of the story that changes the entire analysis. Because the question was never whether the United States could defeat the Iranian military in open engagement. Of course it could. The question was always, what happens after? What fills the vacuum? What governs? What stabilizes? Regime change through force produces rubble and resentment. Regime change through internal collapse produces something far more useful, a transition that the regime's own population demanded, that the regime's own institutions could not prevent, and that outside powers can credibly claim they didn't engineer. The three-dimensional architecture of this trap operates simultaneously on 3 planes. The first plane is economic. The IRGC's 30 to 40% grip on the economy is simultaneously its greatest strength and its most catastrophic structural flaw. When the economy contracts, and under sustained oil pressure it contracts sharply, the IRGC cannot quietly retreat. It owns too much. The failures become visibly its failures. The shortages become visibly its shortages. The people standing in lines for subsidized bread know who controls the import contracts. The people watching their savings evaporate know which institutions are beyond accountability. The IRGC absorbs the rage that used to be directed at a distant government, because now the IRGC is the government. In revolutionary terms, this is known as eating the revolution, and history does not treat it kindly. The second plane is military. The Artesh fracture matters because it represents something rare in the Iranian system, a professional institution with its own identity that has been systematically degraded. Soldiers with 20 bullets are not loyal soldiers. They are not even soldiers in any meaningful operational sense. They are men in uniforms with a grudge, and crucially, with access to weapons. On the 12th day of the military operation that began in late February, reports emerged, unverified but consistent across multiple independent monitors, of units dissolving from hunger, dehydration, and supply failure. 1 million-man army, 12 days. Supply chains so thin that the structure began collapsing under its own weight. This is not what defeat from the outside looks like. This is what rot from the inside looks like. The third plane is social. And here's where the historical pattern becomes almost mathematically regular. Iran has experienced major protest cycles in 2009, 2017, 2019, and 2022. Every single one of them had an economic trigger. Not ideology, not theology, not geopolitics, money, food, gasoline, the price of an egg. In 2019, the regime cut fuel subsidies and protests erupted in Tabriz, Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz simultaneously. 4 major cities, each with its own local character, its own history, its own grievances, igniting at the same moment because the economic nerve had been struck. That is not coincidence. That is a system under pressure finding its fault lines. What the current architecture does is apply pressure to all three of those fault lines at the same time. Economic deterioration fuels social unrest. Social unrest strains the military and the IRGC, forcing them to redirect resources from external projection to internal suppression. Internal suppression deepens the Artesh IRGC institutional fracture. The fracture undermines military cohesion. Military incoherence signals weakness to the population, which amplifies the social unrest. And the cycle tightens. This is not a strategy that plays out over years. Under the right conditions, it plays out over weeks. Now consider the regional dimension, because no trap is complete without walls on every side. The Belfer Center's analysis of Hezbollah's current operational posture describes an organization that has had its supply lines severed and is in active reconstruction mode. Hezbollah was Iran's primary external projection force, the long arm that extended Tehran's reach into Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Without resupply, without cash flows, without the logistical architecture that Iran provided through Syrian corridors and Lebanese financial networks, Hezbollah is no longer a deterrent force. It is a rehabilitation project. The wall that Iran built to its west, its forward defense, its resistance axis, is being quietly dismantled from behind, not from the front. Iran cannot project. It cannot resupply its proxies. It cannot reinforce its position in the region. And it cannot demonstrate strength at home because the economic architecture that funded that strength is under terminal pressure. But here is the detail that closes the analysis. The number that changes the entire story. 20 minutes. In a documented naval engagement in Iranian-claimed waters, an operation mounted by Iranian forces collapsed. Not over hours, not over days, in 20 minutes. An operation in their own backyard, in the waters they have spent a generation claiming as their strategic sovereign zone, fell apart in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Whatever the specific circumstances of that engagement, the signal it sends is unmistakable. The capability gap between Iranian forces and their adversaries is not bridgeable by will or rhetoric. It is structural. And structural gaps, unlike tactical ones, cannot be overcome by morale. The regime knows this, and this is perhaps the most dangerous moment, not when a regime faces external pressure, but when it recognizes that the pressure is working and begins to calculate its options with a shrinking clock. A regime under pressure that still believes it can fight will fight. A regime under pressure that has concluded it cannot win, but cannot negotiate without losing its identity, tends toward two outcomes: either internal fracture that produces transition, or external escalation designed to reset the terms of the conflict. The second option, deliberate escalation, a provocation large enough to reframe the narrative, is always on the table, always. And it is why the current moment demands attention at a level that most mainstream coverage is not providing. What the United States has constructed, whether by design or by the accumulation of consistent strategic pressure across multiple administrations, is a situation in which Iran's most powerful institution, the IRGC, now bears the weight of an economy it cannot sustain, a military it cannot equip, a population it cannot satisfy, and a regional architecture it can no longer project. The IRGC spent decades accumulating power as a parallel state. Parallel states are easy to build. They are catastrophic to be when the primary state they were feeding off begins to collapse. The question is no longer whether the pressure is working. The question is whether the transition, when it comes, will be managed or catastrophic. Because here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. The United States may have designed the perfect trap, but perfect traps don't guarantee clean outcomes. They guarantee change. And the history of the Middle East is, in large part, a history of changes that no outside architect fully controlled once the structure began to move. The protests that will come, if the economic trajectory continues, and every data point suggests it will not arrive with a program. They will not arrive with a unified leadership or a constitutional roadmap or a transitional government waiting in the wings. They will arrive as they always do, in Tabriz, in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Shiraz, in 100 smaller cities and towns where people decide simultaneously that the price being paid is no longer acceptable. And what happens in those moments depends entirely on whether the military apparatus orders suppression, whether those orders are followed, and whether the fracture between the Artesh and the IRGC produces the one thing that the regime cannot survive, a military that refuses to fire on its own people. That refusal, historically, is the moment regimes end. Not the protests, the refusal. We are not there yet, but the architecture that was built to produce exactly that moment is already in place. Watch what happens in the next 30 days. Watch the oil revenue numbers. Watch the protest geography, whether it remains in major urban centers or begins to appear in smaller provincial cities, which is historically the signal that compression is becoming systemic rather than local. Watch the IRGC's economic announcements, when they begin to sound defensive rather than expansive. When the language shifts from projection to justification, you will know the pressure has reached the institutional level where it cannot be absorbed. And watch Hormuz. Not for a blockade, for the shipping data, for the rerouting patterns, for the insurance premiums on tankers transiting that 21-mile channel. The Strait will tell you everything the press releases are designed to hide. This story is not finished. It has barely begun. The next phase, the sequence of events that determines whether this becomes a managed transition, a violent fracture, or a desperate escalation, is unfolding right now, in budget meetings and military briefings and protest WhatsApp groups and supply depot inventories and the quiet conversations between Artesh officers who are looking at 20 bullets and doing the math. We will be here when it moves. If you aren't subscribed to Iron Dispatch yet, this is the video that should change that. What we are covering is not a news cycle. It is a sequence with a logic, and the logic is accelerating. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story will not wait for you to find it. And when it breaks, you'll want to understand the architecture we've just walked through. The trap was built quietly. The walls are already in place. What happens inside them, that part is still being written.